The silence had become a third person in their marriage. Emma stared across the breakfast table at David, watching him scroll through emails while his coffee grew cold. 4 years ago, he would have looked up when she entered the room. 4 years ago, he would have noticed she'd worn the blue dress he once said made her eyes look like sapphires. David. Her voice cut through the morning quiet. He didn't look up from his phone. We need to talk. This time he glanced up, but his expression was already defensive. If this is about the Henderson project again, Emma, I told you, it's not about work. She sat down across from him, her hands trembling slightly as she wrapped them around her mug. It's about us. The word hung in the air like smoke. David finally set his phone down, but his jaw was already tight. What about us? Where could she even begin? With the way they'd become strangers sharing a bed, the conversations that never went deeper than grocery lists and utility bills, the way he flinched now when she tried to touch him, as if intimacy had become an inconvenience? I feel like I'm disappearing, she said softly. Like we're just existing in the same space, but not actually living together anymore. David's architect mind immediately went into problem-solving mode. Look, I know I've been working late, but the firm is going through a transition. Once the Henderson project is complete. This isn't about one project, David. This is about us not having a real conversation in months. This is about you coming to bed after I'm already asleep and leaving before I wake up. This is about feeling like I'm married to a ghost. His face hardened. So what exactly are you saying, Emma? The question she'd been avoiding for weeks sat like a stone in her throat. I think I need some space. Some time to figure out what we're even doing here. The color drained from David's face. Space. Not forever. Just a break. Time to think. Time to remember who we are when we're not just going through the motions. A break. He repeated the word like it tasted bitter. Right. So you want to run away? I want to save our marriage, Emma said, her voice rising. But I can't do it alone, and I can't keep pretending everything is fine when it's not. David stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor. Fine. Take your space, Emma. Take all the space you need. He was already reaching for his keys, his face a mask she didn't recognize. This wasn't how she'd imagined this conversation going. She'd pictured tears, maybe anger, but also understanding, a mutual recognition that they'd lost their way. Instead, she watched her husband walk out the door without looking back, and for the first time in months, the silence felt absolute. 2 hours later, Emma was packing a bag, her sister Claire's, voice echoing in her head. Sometimes you have to break something to fix it. She just hoped there would still be something left to repair. Emma's childhood bedroom at Claire's house felt like a museum of her former self. Surrounded by college textbooks and faded posters, she stared at the ceiling and let memories wash over her like waves. 5 years ago, grind coffee shop on 5th Street. She'd been rushing, late for a client meeting, when she'd collided with a tall man carrying 2 steaming cups. Coffee had splashed everywhere, soaking her white blouse and his blue button-down. "Oh, God, I'm so sorry," they'd said in unison, then laughed at their synchronicity. David, though she hadn't known his name yet, had insisted on buying her a new coffee and paying for her dry cleaning. "I'm an architect," he'd said, dabbing at his shirt with napkins. "I'm supposed to be good at spatial awareness." "Marketing manager," she'd replied, accepting his offered jacket. "I'm supposed to be good at making first impressions." They'd talked for 2 hours. She'd missed her meeting entirely and hadn't cared. Their first kiss had happened 3 weeks later, outside her apartment after their 5th date. David had cupped her face so gently as if she were made of glass, and whispered, "I've been wanting to do this since the moment you smiled at me in that coffee shop." The kiss had been soft at first, tentative, then deeper, as she'd pressed closer to him. Her hands had found their way into his hair, and he'd made this small sound of surrender that had made her knees weak. "Come upstairs," she'd breathed against his lips. That night had been magic. Slow hands and whispered confessions, the way he'd traced constellations on her bare shoulder with his fingertips, how they'd talked until dawn wrapped in nothing but bedsheets and possibility. Meanwhile, across town, David sat in their empty house, holding their wedding photo. In it, Emma's head was thrown back in laughter at something he'd whispered in her ear. He'd told her she looked like starlight in her dress. He remembered their honeymoon in Santorini, morning coffee on the balcony, Emma's hair wild from sleep, and salt air, the way she'd pulled him back to bed with that mischievous smile that used to make his world stop. 5 more minutes, she'd murmured, her lips finding the sensitive spot just below his ear. The ruins have been there for thousands of years. They can wait. He'd made love to her as the Mediterranean sun painted their skin gold, and afterward, she'd traced lazy patterns on his chest. "Promise me we'll always have mornings like this," she'd whispered. "Always," he'd promised. Now, David set the photo down and rubbed his eyes. When had always become never? When had he stopped seeing her across their breakfast table and started seeing only his phone? When had coming home to Emma become just another item on his endless to-do list? His phone buzzed. Another work email. This time he turned it off, but it was too late. Emma was already gone, and David was beginning to understand that maybe, just maybe, he'd been gone long before she walked out the door. Dr. Martinez's office smelled like lavender and leather. Emma twisted her wedding ring as she sat across from the therapist, trying to articulate the ache that had settled in her chest. "I love him," she said for the 3rd time that session. "That's what makes this so hard. If I didn't love him, I would have just left." "Tell me about that love," Dr. Martinez encouraged. "When did you know?" Emma's mind drifted to a rainy Thursday evening 2 months into their relationship. She'd been sick with the flu, and David had shown up at her apartment with homemade soup and terrible romantic comedies. "You didn't have to come," she'd croaked from under 3 blankets. "Where else would I be?" he'd said, settling beside her, on the couch. When she'd fallen asleep against his shoulder, he'd stayed perfectly still for hours, one hand stroking her hair. She'd woken up knowing she was falling in love with his kindness. "I knew when he took care of me when I was sick," she told Dr. Martinez, "and I knew for certain the night he proposed." David had recreated their first date at the coffee shop, complete with intentionally spilled coffee. But instead of napkins, he'd pulled out a ring box from his jacket pocket. "Emma Catherine Walsh," he'd said, dropping to one knee right there by table 7. "You've made every day an adventure since the moment you crashed into my life. Will you let me spend forever trying to deserve you?" Through happy tears, she'd whispered, "Yes," and he'd slipped the ring onto her finger with shaking hands. Later that night, they'd made love with desperate tenderness, as if trying to memorize each other's heartbeats. "I need to go back to him," Emma told Dr. Martinez. "I need to fight for us." Across town, David sat in his best friend Ryan's living room, divorce papers spread across the coffee table like evidence of failure. "She walked out, man," Ryan said, refilling David's whiskey glass. "She blocked your number. What more clarity do you need?" David stared at the papers, remembering the night he'd signed their marriage license. Emma had been radiant in her white dress, laughing as she'd accidentally written her maiden name first, then crossed it out with exaggerated dramatic flair. "Mrs. Emma Catherine Torres," she'd practiced, leaning into him. "I like the sound of that." "I love the sound of that," he'd corrected, kissing her temple. But Ryan was right, wasn't he? Emma had asked for space, then vanished. No calls, no texts, no indication she wanted to work things out. What was David supposed to think? "She's not coming back." David said quietly, signing his name on the dissolution papers with finality that felt like dying. And maybe that's for the best. He was wrong, but he wouldn't know that for another 3 days. Emma, meanwhile, had already bought groceries for David's favorite dinner. She was coming home to save their marriage, not knowing her husband was busy ending it. Emma's key still fit the lock, but the house felt wrong the moment she stepped inside. The silence was different. Not the heavy, tension-filled quiet she'd left behind, but something hollower, empty. Her footsteps echoed differently on the hardwood floors, and it took her a moment to realize why. David's shoes weren't by the front door. Her heart began to race as she moved through their home like a detective cataloging evidence of abandonment. The living room felt cavernous without his architectural books scattered across the coffee table. The wall where his framed blueprints had hung showed pale rectangles against the paint. In their bedroom, Emma's breath caught. David's side of the closet gaped open, hangers swaying like skeletal fingers. His pillow was gone. Even his phone charger had been unplugged from the nightstand. She sank onto the bed they'd shared for 4 years, remembering their first night in this house. They'd made love on a mattress on the floor while boxes surrounded them like cardboard. Mountains! We did it! David had whispered afterward, his arm tight around her waist. Our first house. Our forever house, Emma had corrected, tracing circles on his bare chest. Forever, he'd agreed, catching her hand and bringing it to his lips. Now, that forever house felt like a mausoleum. Emma found the divorce papers in the kitchen, precisely placed on the table where they used to share breakfast. The envelope was thick, official, final. Her name was typed across the front in stark black letters, Emma Catherine Torres. Not even Walsh Torres, the hyphenation she'd eventually chosen. Just Torres, as if their marriage had been reduced to a clerical error that needed correcting. Inside, David's signature was already there. Strong, confident strokes that looked nothing like the shaky handwriting from their wedding certificate. A yellow sticky note was attached to the signature page. Your copy. Mine is filed with the court. D. Not Love. David, or even just David. Just D, as if even his full name was too intimate to share with her now. Emma's phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number. This is David's new number. Don't contact me. The papers are self-explanatory. Her fingers trembled as she typed back. David, please. This isn't what I wanted. Can we talk? The response came immediately. There's nothing left to talk about. You made your choice. I chose us, she wrote desperately. I was coming back to fight for us. 3 dots appeared, then disappeared. Then, you have 30 days to respond to the papers or it becomes uncontested. I won't make this difficult for you. Emma stared at the phone until the screen went black, then hurled it across the room. It hit the wall with a satisfying crack, but the pain in her chest only grew stronger. She'd wanted space to save their marriage. Instead, she'd given David permission to end it, and now she had to figure out how to fight for a man who'd already decided she was gone. Emma refused to sign the papers. For 3 weeks, she launched a campaign to win back her own husband. She sent letters to his office, returned unopened, showed up at his job sites, security escorted her away, and even cornered Ryan at the grocery store. He's hurting, Emma, Ryan had said, not unkindly. Maybe it's time to let him heal. We're both hurting, Emma replied. That's exactly why we need to heal together. The breakthrough came when she remembered David's Tuesday night basketball league. She waited in the parking lot, heart hammering, until she saw him emerge from the community center. He looked thinner, she realized, tired. When their eyes met, across the asphalt his step faltered. Emma. Her name sounded rusty in his voice. You can't keep doing this. I'm not signing those papers. You have to. It's over. But his voice cracked on the last word. Look me in the eye and tell me you stopped loving me, she challenged, stepping closer. Tell me that what we had meant nothing to you. David's, jaw worked silently. Finally, what we had doesn't matter if it doesn't work. But it did work. We got lost, David. We forgot how to talk to each other. That doesn't mean we give up. You gave up when you walked out. I asked for a break, not a divorce. Emma's voice broke. I was trying to save us, not end us. For the first time since she'd returned, David really looked at her. She saw the moment his carefully constructed walls began to crack. I thought... He swallowed hard. I thought you were done with me. Never, Emma whispered, stepping closer. I could never be done with you. The kiss happened without planning, desperate and salt-tinged with tears, 4 years of love and hurt and longing compressed into a single moment. David's hands tangled in her hair the way they used to, and Emma felt like she could breathe again for the first time in weeks. I've been so stupid, David murmured against her lips. I thought letting you go was what you wanted. What I want is my husband back, Emma said fiercely. What I want is to fight for us instead of against each other. 6 months later, they renewed their vows at Grind Coffee Shop on 5th Street, surrounded by family and friends and the ghosts of their younger selves. Emma wore the same blue dress from that first morning, and David's hands didn't shake when he slipped her original wedding ring back onto her finger. I promise to fight for us, he said, his voice steady and sure. Even when, especially when it gets hard. I promise to stay and fight with you, Emma replied. No more running away. They'd learned that love wasn't just about the good times. It was about choosing each other even when choosing felt impossible, especially then. The coffee shop erupted in applause, but Emma only heard David's whispered forever, and this time she knew they both meant it.